Episode 2: The World Before 1914. A unique and extraordinary eclipse occurred during the first months of 1900. For a minute and a half, and hidden by the moon, the sun projected a huge shadow that advanced at a rate of 70 kilometers per second from the Pacific to the Atlantic. At dusk, it had come to rest the Red Sea. It was a dark and gloomy omen for a century that would be predestined to become a time of violence. From its beginnings, a clear obsession marked the 20th century. Progression, innovation, changing the world. As a symbol of disproportionate confidence that bordered on arrogance, the first rigid airship in history took to the air. After 25 years of work, Count von Zeppelin saw his cigar-shaped airship rise more than 400 meters into the skies, a craft that would popularize his name, the Zeppelin. The 20th century would be a century of the masses and of social conflict that grew in importance until 1905. Many saw these events as a threat to economic development. Continuous strikes, disorders, and demands only contributed to invigorate social activity. They became the motors for progress. In spite of social achievements, unrest spread from Argentina to England. The Workers' Federation was founded in Chile, while Argentina saw the creation of the Workers' Regional Confederation, and the first labor unions appeared in Colombia. In Spain, the 1902 general strike organized by the anarchists accentuated unrest and seriously altered social peace. Street riots in Barcelona brought troops out into the streets, and constitutional rights were suspended. Many died and many more were arrested. Social problems were a permanent concern until the beginning of the Great War. 1903 saw the death of Pope Leo XIII, a man who in 1900 was fully aware that social and economic differences bore the seeds of discord. He was the Pope of the workers. In his encyclical Rerum Novarum of New Things, he exhorted the world to help the underprivileged and to listen to the problems of the working class. The women's suffrage movement, the heir to women's rights groups of the mid-19th century, demanded the right to vote, which they partially achieved in England in 1918. Women entered the university for the first time. In Italy, the anarchist Bresci shot at Umberto I in Monza, practically at the same time that someone made an attempt on the life of the Prince of Wales in Brussels. In this same campaign, organized by international anarchism, American President William McKinley was fatally shot in 1901, while other attempts were planned on the lives of the sovereigns of England, Spain, Austria, Portugal, and Russia. The unexpected and tragic death of McKinley in the United States brought Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency. He continued in his predecessor's imperialist footsteps. Queen Victoria died in 1901, and with her a way of conducting politics. England decided to turn its back on isolationism, but all the attempts by Joseph Chamberlain to better relations with Germany were employed by Emperor William II to muddy Anglo-Russian relations and to poison the political panorama. Europe lived through a time of alliances which eventually coalesced into wary blocs. The Entente Cordiale of England and France that would later be joined by Russia and Serbia, and the Triple Alliance constituted by Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Even so, Italy played its own game. Victor Emmanuel III came to a secret agreement with France, which recognized Italy's rights over the Libyan provinces of Tripoli and Cyrenaica. But it was a tense world due to overriding suspicions, conflict, and colonial clashes, together with a fight for markets and concessions. Desertions and clashes came as no surprise, while espionage and counter-espionage, sometimes real and other times imaginary, were commonplace phenomena. In 1905, German Emperor William II landed his forces in Tangier and proclaimed himself the defender of Islam. He urged the European powers to come to grips with the Moroccan problem, especially after his meeting with Nicholas II of Russia, which led nowhere. A conference was held in Algeciras in 1906 at the request of the Kaiser. Germany claimed a major diplomatic victory, although it was a Pyrrhic victory since France and Spain established protectorates in the territory. By 1907, England had agreed to smooth over differences which arose with Russia due to their respective colonial activities in Asia. Russia recognized English rights in Afghanistan and in the Persian Gulf, while Russian and English authorities agreed to leave Tibet in peace. At the same time, England induced Japan to sign a friendship agreement with Nicholas II. An extraordinarily powerful bloc was formed as a result. France, England and Russia, with their respective colonial empires, and with the approval and connivance of the Japanese Empire. The Triple Entente was born. Serbia was a sore point for international politics. In 1903, King Alexander I and his wife were murdered, along with the Prime Minister, two brothers of the monarch, and the Minister of War. The international panorama was complex. In 1904, Russia declared war on Japan, which had conducted a surprise attack on Port Arthur under Russian control. Japan defeated the Tsarist forces, and the military disaster was complete. Thousands died, and enormous quantities of armament fell into Japanese hands. Russia renounced its claims over Korea, and it lost control over half of Sakhalin Island. Japan strengthened its hold over Manchuria and became the dominant naval power in the Pacific. American President Theodore Roosevelt had to mediate, and in August 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed. Roosevelt's intervention earned him the 1906 Nobel Peace Prize. The Tsar imposed strict censorship, and the news came late, but when it did, disorders were unleashed, such as the mutiny aboard the battleship Potemkin. The incident occurred after an officer shot a sailor. The crew immediately mutinied, and a red flag was finally hoisted up the mainmast of the warship, anchored in the Black Sea. That 27th of June witnessed the murder of all the ship's officers. In 1906, the Bosnian crisis almost sparked a war in the West. The foreign ministers of Russia, Izvolsky, and Austria, Aehrenthal, backed an imperialist policy for the Balkans. Russia sought a way out of the Black Sea by means of the Turkish Straits, while Austria did not want to lose its influence over the Balkans. Matters rushed to a head. In 1908, the Young Turk Party had many sympathizers in the army. It finally seized power in Constantinople with the overthrow of the Sultan Abdul Hamid. The modernization of the old empire was underway. Austria took advantage of the situation to annex Bosnia-Herzegovina. Russia agreed to this new political situation in exchange for Austria's help in obtaining its control over the Straits. The Austrians occupied Bosnia in October 1908. As a result, Bulgaria proclaimed its independence while Greece annexed Crete. All the pieces were moving in a complex game of political chess. Italy, whose foreign policies were erratic, believed the time had come to reap the harvest of its diplomacy. Italy demanded Libya from Turkey. Turkey ignored its claims, and Italy decided to attack. In 1912, and during Italy's campaign in Libya, the first bombs were dropped from an airplane, cans of nitroglycerine. Just a few years later, in 1914, steel darts were launched at persons from early aircraft at the beginning of the First World War. The Italo-Turkish War was taken advantage of by both Bulgaria and Serbia, which signed a treaty sponsored by Russia in 1912. Greece and Montenegro signed the accord later. They all declared war on Turkey. Straining its resources to fight the Balkan states, Constantinople finally decided to sign the Treaty of Lausanne, which ceded Libya and the Dodecanese Islands, including Rhodes, to Italy in 1912. The Balkan nations also shared the spoils. Montenegro seized Scutari, the Serbs took Uskub and Monastir, the Greeks conquered Salonika, and the Bulgarians fought the Turks at the doors of Constantinople. Albania, meanwhile, declared its independence. To make matters worse, Romania invaded the Danube area, and even though Austria wanted to lend a hand to poor Bulgarian Tsar Ferdinand I by attacking Serbia, both Germany and Italy were opposed, thus the danger of a general conflict receded. Nationalist feelings were reinforced in Europe, countries began to rearm, and people began to suspect that war was around the corner. Diplomats became involved in long-range suspicions. Some peoples, like the Jews, began to feel the romantic call of a long-lost homeland where anti-Semite persecutions and oppression would simply not exist. After meeting with the Sultan of Turkey, an Austrian Jewish journalist, Theodor Herzl, published a book in 1902 that would become the basis of Zionism, Alt New Land, Old New Land. He invited people of the same faith to emigrate to Israel, the land of their ancestors, where philologists, Eliezer ben Yehuda was preparing the grammar of modern-day Hebrew so that the new arrivals could begin to learn the biblical language. Events moved rapidly in the Arab world too. In 1912, Ibn Saud of Arabia wrested away the important province of Al-Khazar from the Turks. He was able to give his mercurial, volatile, and nomadic people a collective ideal. England was especially concerned due to the growing numbers of German submarines that threatened British naval supremacy. From 1905 to 1913, there were 4 international crises, 2 involving the Balkans and 2 North Africa. The diplomatic skirmishes first and later the theatres of war put an end to the Turkish Empire. Nicholas II was a hopeless ruler. He was unable to surround himself with capable people. He was fickle and faithful to the last person who appeared on the scene, inevitably his wife. He was mistaken in his Russianization policies, limiting the influence of German and French cultures, while his anti-Semite practices deprived him of the support of the Jews, one of Russia's most enlightened social segments. In 1903, he stripped the Armenian Church of its funds for education and social welfare, making enemies of his most valuable allies against the Turks. The student demonstrations of 1900, which were often joined by factory workers, were broken up by Cossack cavalry instead of by intelligent measures and dialogue. These were the seeds of the Bolshevik Revolution. In Russian, Bolshevik means majority, and Lenin used the term to describe his own party, employing the word Menshevik or minority when referring to the opposition. Together with his domestic policies, Nicholas II also adopted mistaken foreign policies. He believed it was unacceptable to give up Korea to the Japanese and conserve Manchuria. Due to his stubbornness, he lost the Baltic Fleet in the Tsushima Straits in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. The crushing defeat against the Japanese brought much more than territorial losses. It brought revolution. On Sunday, January the 22nd, 1905, bloody events were staged at the very doors of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, where Cossacks slaughtered more than 1,000 demonstrators headed by the clergyman Gapon. What did they want? Simply to deliver to the Tsar a list of claims as a massive strike of 100,000 workers took place in the region. American policies in the early 20th century were designed to obtain a big slice of the colonial pie. The war declared against Spain in 1898 was a link in that chain. Following the sinking of the Maine in Havana Bay, an outraged American public opinion reacted to the far-eating press and politicians and forced Congress, after consultations with President McKinley, to declare war on a colonial power. It was a short-lived war. That same year, Spain signed the Treaty of Paris, whereby it ceded Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. American foreign policy was imperialist in scope, especially following the annexions of Hawaii and the former Spanish islands. In other words, the United States assumed Spain's former position in the Americas and Asia, and especially in the Far East, where it had designs on splitting up China with the European powers. In 1903, the US bought the Canal Zone in Panama. After provoking the schism with Colombia, it renewed work on the canal, concluding them in 1914. Problems with trusts and cartels shaped domestic policies, and this led to the creation of the FBI in 1908, a federal body that would investigate and bring to justice everyone from land robbers in the West to magnates behind the trusts in the East. It was a brilliant moment for the country, since it was evident the United States was an emerging world power. An air force was created, but it was necessary to convince Congress of its future importance. Finally, construction on a military model that flew 58 kilometers per hour was authorized. Roosevelt was a discreet man. Hardly anyone knew that he was practically blind in his left eye. He also showed courage. In one of his re-election speeches, he was shot by a fanatic, and even though he was obviously bleeding, he didn't step down until he finished what he had to say. He was always proud of the fact that he was the first president who flew both in a plane and drove in a car. His successor, William Taft, led the United States from 1908 to 1912. He simply wasn't prepared for the new times. Even though honest, he lacked a vision. As a matter of fact, he was responsible for removing the progressive wing of his Republican Party and a schism seemed inevitable. The legendary frontier land of Buffalo Bill and Mae West slowly disappeared. February 1909 saw the death of the last great Apache Indian, Geronimo. He had held American cavalry in check for years. Significantly, the buffalo also began to disappear. There were scarcely 1,000 head of the more than 4 million that had roamed the ranges of America 50 years before. Interventionist policies continued in Latin America under Thomas Woodrow Wilson, who became president in 1913. The 1910 uprising in Mexico against President Porfirio Díaz marked the beginning of the revolution headed by Francisco Madero and supported by Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa, who championed the down and out. The political situation had grown worse in Spain by 1906. The elections didn't help matters because fraud was suspected. King Alfonso XIII was the target of an assassination attempt in Paris. The king had married that same year the English princess Victoria Eugenia of Battenberg, and an attempt was made on their lives as they returned to their palace, the second on the monarch. The royal couple escaped unharmed, but 30 other people died. In Belgium, King Leopold II gave his country the Congo territories in 1907. Colonialism and imperialism went their chaotic way. It wasn't difficult to understand. Slaves, ivory, rubber, and wood weren't as profitable as in previous decades. They weren't enough to meet the administrative and military costs of that colony. Colonies only generated wars. The whole world witnessed, not without a certain amount of shame, the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1901. Not only did they lose, but they were forced to make £67 million in reparations. The first Nobel Prizes were awarded in 1901. One of the first award winners to receive the distinction from the King of Sweden was Wilhelm Röntgen for his invention of the X-ray. In 1905, Albert Einstein argued that there is no fixed reference point from which distances can be measured. It was the first law of relativity. The husband and wife team, Pierre and Marie Curie, were able to isolate polonium and radium, a discovery of extraordinary importance that earned them the Nobel Physics Prize in 1903. In 1911, Marie Curie also received the Nobel Chemistry Prize for determining the nature of radium. Freud began his psychoanalysis of Dora and published The Interpretation of Dreams, delving into the complexity of the psyche for the first time in medicine. Psychiatry flourished. The Spanish researcher Santiago Ramón y Cajal, Nobel Prize winner for medicine in 1906, established the basis for a new scientific discipline, histology and the study of the nervous system. He also discovered the neuronal theory. In the world of sports, the century began with the Paris Olympiad. Sports in general became enormously popular. The Davis Cup was created and the International Cycling Union was founded. Many records were broken at the time. Women soon began to widely practice sports and excelled in many, such as golf. The 1904 Olympics were held in St. Louis, Missouri, and the 1908 edition, or Fourth Olympiad, took place in London after Italy renounced the organization of the Games. "1900 is the year of the Universal Expo in Paris. More than 50 million people visited its many pavilions. Nothing caused more amazement than the cinematographer, electricity, and Art Nouveau. Astonished visitors viewed a film that for the first time synchronized sound to picture. A fragment of Hamlet was screened, with the voice of Sarah Bernhardt. In England, Edwin S. Porter presented his film The Great Train Robbery, which, according to specialists, marks the beginning of cinematographic art and technique. Cinema took its first steps. In 1908, Blackton Courtet, Mackay and Sullivan transposed paper drawings to film. Cartoons were born, but it wouldn't be until 1922 when Disney would start to make his first shorts. Improvements were made on cars. Windscreens were marketed in 1903, while bumpers or fenders followed in 1905, and just 1 year later, the rear view mirror. The car soon became man's best friend, and that of his better half. Urban growth created the phenomenon of city congestion. The taxi was created to resolve transport needs. The first appeared in Paris in 1904. This was also the golden age of the tram or streetcar, a romantic form of getting about where writers, painters, and photographers set their tales of love. The first skyscrapers were built and neon lights began to substitute incandescent lamps in street advertising. Boulevards and streets got busier, and the almost natural solution to ordering traffic soon appeared: traffic lights. The first two-color light was used in Cleveland at the corner of 105 Street with Euclid Avenue during August 1914. 4 years later, the traffic light with the current three-color system was introduced in New York. The Central Station was inaugurated in that city in 1913, the largest in the world. The station could handle 143 wagons. It covered 32 hectares, while subterranean passageways led to nearby hotels and services. Transport was an important priority for industrialized countries. In the midst of all this euphoria, an iceberg sank the most luxurious and safest boat in the world one night in April 1912. This immense luxury liner sank just 5 days after having weighed anchor at the English port of Southampton. It was the Titanic. Even though previous attempts had been made, such as those by Englishman George Cayley or German Otto Lilienthal, the first effectively controlled flight with the possibility of changing course and landing was achieved in 1903 by Orville and Wilbur Wright with a 274-kilogram biplane and a 4-cylinder, 12-horsepower engine. The aircraft was airborne for 59 seconds and covered a distance of a little over half a mile in the skies of North Carolina. Over the next decade, flying became a sport. In 1909, Frenchman Louis Blériot crossed the English Channel between Calais and Dover during a 37-minute flight. The aircraft was a 4-blade propeller monoplane that heated up so much it had to be lubricated in flight. Radio broadcasting was in its very early stages, but its enormous possibilities were already heralded in 1910. Dunwoody and Pickard invented the Galena or crystal radio, the first receiver in history. Picasso arrived in Paris in 1900 and he soon joined the vanguard of artistic movements. He reflected the anxiety and disquiet of those post-impressionists who sought new forms of expression. He absorbed it all and passed it through the sieve of his artistic personality. Picasso is undoubtedly the synthesis of the history of art in the 20th century. The nascent Art Nouveau shared the attention of critics and experts with the beginning of Cubism. Matisse, Rouault, Renoir, and others were greeted by critics in the 1905 Autumn Salon in Paris as the wild beast, les fauves. Fauvism set out to show the intimate nature of things, what Matisse called nature naturelle. This technique employed simple coloring, balance, purity, and defined outlines. But from 1819 to 1910, the architectural form of expression that best reflected the times is modernism. Antonio Gaudí created the Güell Park in Barcelona. A new form of viewing the world held sway. This unconscious tendency endowed the times with its spiritual identity, an attitude of tense expectation with respect to the future, and a determination to substitute the cultural past with a new driving force designed for tomorrow. However, a future of suffering awaited that generation, a traumatic tomorrow right around the corner, the First World War.